Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast, the podcast all about the delicate balance between people and business, and quite literally, reconnecting the two. My name is Tracy Rubin, and I've spent nearly my entire professional career in HR. Join me as I share stories, opinions, and words of advice with you each week. Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. Thank you for being here for another week. This week, I really don't even know what to say. I feel like we have to talk about the elephant in the room, which is COVID. And, I thought when 2022 started, I guess I thought in my mind that the podcast would maybe not talk about COVID for another few months, or maybe like only about different policies and mandates, but this elephant is just staring at me. So we're going to have to talk about it because, you can't ignore an elephant in a room. Before I even get into COVID and all of that, I just want to mention and really, I guess, say thank you to those of you who have been sharing the podcast. I mentioned on last week's episode, which hopefully you've listened to by now, I mentioned that, one of my biggest goals is to really grow the podcast. And so thank you if you have been sharing it. I saw on Instagram a handful of you reposting and sharing the episode. So thank you so much. And what I will say is that at the end of this episode, when you pull your phone back out, or you go back to the Spotify screen, or maybe you're listening on your computer, wherever you are in the world, before you close out the episode, if you can just share it with someone that you think would appreciate the episode, or just share the podcast with someone, I would really appreciate it. But this is officially the second episode of 2022, which is crazy. I mean, that means that we're already 2 weeks in. So as we know it, the year is going to fly by. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. And I have to be candid with you. I am talking about something that is so true and real for me when I mention this, that HR, the job that we play, the role we play, I should say, the job that we fulfill, has changed forever. And I thought last year, when we talked about the pandemic a little bit, and we talked about how, HR has changed a bit, that would be almost like a temporary change. I think in my mind that was the case. But all I can say is that I think that our jobs have permanently changed forever, unless someone above us decides, or with us decides, that we can, maybe add on to the team. So I'm going to break this down. The first place that this comes from for me is that I have not had a break since 2020 in terms of dealing with the realities of the pandemic. And I'm not saying that to be like, woe is me. I'm just saying this because I think that many of you who are in people-facing functions, because there's certainly HR jobs that are not people-facing, but if you're in a people-facing HR role, or if you're not in HR and you're a manager listening to this, then you can totally commiserate with me that the pandemic puts so much pressure and workload on our jobs. And so we have, for the last 2 years, been working, if you're like me, pretty much 24/7, meaning like always on call, always needing to be available. Even if you're on PTO, you are just there, especially if you don't have, a ton of resources, meaning like a ton of people who are supporting with, this part of the job or part of the business. But we know if you're in a people-facing function, that means that because COVID is something that impacts people, that you are going to be under a different type of pressure than someone in a non-people-facing role, for example. So one of the things that I'm really trying to get to here is that the way that HR has changed is really, and I think the New York Times kind of plays on this quite well, is that we've now not just started like tracking vaccination status or tracking illness. Like, we've really kind of become the school nurse of the business. And I'm not coining that term. This is something that I read in the New York Times, which of course I will link in the show notes as always. But really, like when we think of HR departments, we were doing so well, like growing beyond just managing people issues. And we were doing strategy and we were implementing new policies and procedures and advancing the way that we work. And yet COVID has almost taken that progress and pulled it back and said, oh, wait a second, hold on. We still need the admin side of your job to take precedent. And that's something that, like, for me, the admin side is definitely an undesirable, and like admin sides of jobs are everywhere. HR is super admin heavy, and I know we've talked about this before, but it really can be super admin heavy, and every job will have that, whether you're an HR admin where that is your sole job, or whether you're a VP or head of people, you're always going to have some administrative element, which is totally fine. Every job has its pros and cons, right? But COVID has taken what, like let's take my role, for example, director of HR, taken a role that is typically strategic, focused on, solving problems, different things like being a business partner, elevated business partner role, to really being in the thick of it, being in all of the detailed parts of the business, which again is okay, but at some level, people are going to need more support. And I am speaking from my own experience, but I can only imagine what, HR functions where there are only one person, what they're going through. Like, I'm an individual contributor right now. I don't have anyone on my team, which, in my past role I did. So there was a little bit more support, I would say. But right now, being the only person, there's that same impact that I think people who are only, like, maybe they're like party of one in an HR function, where you are rolling out the policy, managing the day-to-day COVID operations, staying on top of legislation, all of those things remain true for anyone that is in a role like mine, where you are people facing and needing to really kind of like roll with the punches with COVID and just be there 100% of the time. So this is, I'm setting the stage here for what myself and other HR professionals are experiencing and have been experiencing since 2020, especially if you're in Europe. I mean, I think there are so many more nuances. COVID has, quote unquote, been around longer in other parts of the world. So, the way in which we're dealing with these things, there have been, some countries have experienced multiple lockdowns. Some countries like the United States have instituted vaccine mandates. Employers are taking one stance. Governments are taking another stance. It is a hot mess, to say the least, a hot mess. But there are a few solutions to this. And I definitely don't want to just talk about the things that are like annoying, frustrating, a lot of work, without talking about the things that we can do to solve this problem or this challenge. The first and probably the most important thing, if you ask me, is to actually hire people to manage this workload. Because I'll tell you right now, I can't manage all of this on my own, right? Like no one can. If I have, whether I have 200 employees or 50 employees, this COVID, managing COVID, the legislation, the policies, the actual day-to-day operations, collecting vaccination status from new hires, from current employees, because even if you're not rolling out a vaccine mandate, you do still need to know the vaccination status. This is a federal, at least in the US, this is a federal mandate. You do need to know the vaccination status of each individual. But regardless, even if there wasn't a mandate, you would need to know the vaccination status of every individual, because you have to manage their quarantine periods. You have to manage their time out of the business. So regardless of your stance on the mandates, regardless of, whether your company is even following the mandates or not, if you are in an HR position, you do at this point need to know vaccination status, which you needed to know last year too. But let's say you didn't. Now you need to collect that in order to most accurately track quarantine periods, isolations, and really support an individual on what their time out of the business looks like, let's say. So now that we know that, we know that that one solution, hiring someone, could be super helpful. This episode is brought to you by none other than Namely. The last few years, we all know this, have changed the way we work forever. I can't even believe it's been a couple years. Like, it's insane. So we know 2022 will be no exception. We have more remote workforces than ever. There's internal mobility. There are ways in which our team communities are going to continue to evolve. And so obviously, this is all going to be more important than ever, navigating these changes. So that is why you and your company need Namely. It is an all-in-one HR solution that offers everything you need to set you and your teams up for success this new year so that you can meet the new HR trends of 2022 head on. And if you've been listening to this podcast, we talk all about the trends, and we work together to try and figure out how can we tackle these things together. So Namely helps you easily adapt to the ever-changing workplace and maintain a great experience for the entire employee lifecycle, including onboarding, performance management, benefits enrollment, all in one connected platform. Plus, Namely can streamline your payroll, timesheet tracking, and vacation requests. PTO, it can be intense to manage, so give it a shot whether you have 50 or 1,000 employees, so you can be everyone's favorite HR leader, no matter how your company grows. This new year, don't just keep up, get ahead. Learn more about making the switch to Namely today at namely.com. Don't wait, that's namely.com. So I could only imagine how helpful it would be. Imagine if we had like a COVID administrator, HR admin specifically for COVID, right? Like someone who's spending 40 hours a week managing COVID relations, COVID operations. And I don't know, that it's possible that there's like a need for two people, because if you have someone, working during the week, that's great, but who's going to work on the weekends? I say this because just like an employer is going to staff a retail store so that there's full coverage, there needs to be the same approach with things like COVID that don't have a start and end time. Because, for example, I get calls and texts at 10:30 at night, 11:30 at night. I get emails sometimes after midnight, depending on where in the country or in North America the person is. And yes, some of you might say, oh, well, maybe you just wait, you don't answer that until the morning. Totally. But at the end of the day, if individuals need support, and I can only imagine if someone, tests positive for COVID and they're waiting for more instruction, even if the protocol is out there, right? Even if the resources are there, there's probably a little bit of nervousness in wanting to speak to someone, about next steps. How are they going to get paid when they're out of the business? What does that look like? So maybe this is something that's outsourced. Maybe this is something where companies can just pay other companies to manage the intake of a COVID process or a COVID operation. I don't know. I almost feel like this sounds like a cry for help. It might be half of a cry for help because I'm so tired, but I'm not alone, so that gives me some peace. But really, the point here is that the first solution, and probably the easiest to me, is to invest some money, invest some dollars into hiring people who are going to provide coverage so that the HR person in the situation that has been managing this for the last 2 years is not the person managing COVID. Just like DE&I, in my opinion, should sit outside of HR because it's everyone's priority, I think COVID needs to sit within HR, but outside of an existing role, because nothing about our roles and responsibilities has gone away because we've taken on COVID. It's just been added on, just like everyone else. There are managers who have taken on more, there are business owners who have taken on more, right? But this is precisely the concern for me, is that HR people are just adding on to their plate without any reprieve, any break, and it's not sustainable. So if you are in a decision-making position, please take this with you, that we should really be looking at how we are adding on headcount or outsourcing COVID operations if possible. And I think the second solution could be that there is a reset of expectations, because in 2020, naturally, the response was to be super urgent and super available because everything was unknown, right? But maybe now it's a matter of myself and other HR professionals saying, hey, I am not going to be answering anything after the business hours and or on the weekend unless it's urgent and, there's like a need for me to get involved. And maybe there's a matter of saying to the manager and the employees that they need to understand the protocol like the back of their hands as well. And I mean, I would say that I have been doing this like throughout the pandemic because I really believe in empowering individuals to know the information and be clear on policies. But I think that there's always that hesitance to make sure that you are compliant and you're doing things correctly. But again, I think that there probably is a need to level set. Maybe the solution is to actually train the managers on COVID situations and how to handle those things rather than assuming that they've been keeping up this whole time. I don't know. But I also think if you're a manager and you're listening to this and you're not managing COVID or you're relying on someone else to tell you what to do, you're probably part of the problem. Get to know the protocol like the back of your hand so that you can at least say, hey, this is what I've done so far. Does this sound right to you? Is there anything that I've missed? Because I think that the beauty in my role, the places where I take almost like a sigh of relief and a deep breath is when someone says, I've done all of these things based on what you've told me I need to do, based on the resources, based on the protocol. Is there anything that I've missed? Is there anything I need to keep in mind? Should I be doing something differently? And that is not always happening. So maybe that's part of the solution is making it that it's non-negotiable that every single person is responsible for COVID operations. And it's just a matter of dividing and conquering. I don't know. At the same time, as I say that, everyone is overloaded, right? So I don't really know if that's the right answer either. I think my first thought in terms of hiring additional support or outsourcing COVID is probably the only or maybe the best option. Now, I'm gonna end that conversation here. I hope that you're taking time to reflect on this. If you have some different new ideas about how we as HR professionals can manage these things and also be part of the solution, let me know what your thoughts are, because I do think it is our responsibility to figure out, okay, if this is our problem, what our solution is. The other thing that I want to mention is just on the topic of the Great Resignation, because this continues to be the topic. Everyone's like, let's rebrand. It's not the Great Resignation. It's the Great Reshuffle. The Great Reshuffle, which, I can get behind. I can get behind a rebrand. I've rebranded my brand like 7,000 times in 1 month. So I am here for it. Someone brought up a really interesting question, which was that, is it that there are more jobs? Like, how is it? And this was a 2-part question. Is it that there are more jobs? And how are these jobs not getting filled? Because there are people who need work and are unemployed. And my response was that I don't think there are any more jobs. And obviously there's data on this and I could totally pull the numbers, like how many jobs were created versus like today versus last month. But it's not about job creation for me. It's about the number of total jobs, like let's say in the US today versus total jobs in the US this time last year. Because job creation can be misleading, right? That means like how many jobs are opening. But that doesn't mean that they're new jobs. Like my theory actually, and I'd love to be proven wrong or proven right. So I have not been able to find like specific statistics on this yet, but I'm sure if I dig a little bit more in like the Department of Labor numbers that I could probably find it, at least for the US. But anyway, I digress. My point here is that my theory is that there are no more jobs today than there were last year. It's just that the people who were in those jobs have left or have not returned to the workforce, and so they remain open. And so it feels like there are all of these new jobs, but actually if you ask most teams, they are understaffed. So how can you be understaffed with new jobs? You can't. To me, it's that like, let's say January 1st, 2021, there are 10 people on a team. 5 people resign. Now you have 5 active employees and 5 open positions. Those are not 5 new positions. Those are just 5 open positions. And maybe you've closed a couple since January 2021. So maybe now you have 7 active employees and 3 open positions. That team remains understaffed because those jobs remain open. Those 3 open jobs are not necessarily new jobs. They are just open. So unless a team or a company goes from 10 jobs in 2021 to 12 jobs in 2022, you are at the same headcount year to date, except you have fewer people actively in those roles. So, and we know that roles are remaining open for much longer, not only because people are unemployed and maybe they don't want to return for different reasons, but also because it's an extremely competitive market. And I bet you there are some companies that have yet to progress their policies and their procedures and their way of working. And so they remain uncompetitive in the market. And I know this to be true from personal experience, that there are definitely ways that retailers especially can be much more competitive, and they are not being that competitive. So I know if it's happening in retail, which is the largest employer in worldwide in terms of an industry, and also the most under the gun, so to speak, from an understaffing perspective and a need for talent perspective, it just doesn't work. That math doesn't work to be the most in need and the least competitive. So, I think that there is still a responsibility on the employer to attract talent. And you can't just attract talent with money. Employers have to think beyond the scope of salary at this point, because everyone is throwing salary around, right? It's like, oh, we'll pay you this, pay you that, no problem. You have to look at your PTO. You need to look at your maternity and paternity benefits. You need to look at your insurance benefits, like just in total. You need to look at your hourly workforce. Why is there any incentive to be hourly at this point? Like, especially part-time, what are you going to offer them? What incentives do you have for those individuals? What kind of culture, what kind of workplace are you offering? Are there remote and hybrid options? If not, I guarantee you are losing top talent. I see this today where there is a lack of flexibility in the type and way of working, and people are just not into it. Like, I can tell you, if someone told me I had to be back in the office 5 days a week, I would be, applying to a different job. So I know I'm not alone. This is where, again, the ownership is on the employer to figure out how are they going to attract top talent and how are they going to retain top talent. So yes, maybe the salary, maybe someone earning $30,000 more a year is going to be super attracted to the role. But are you going to be able to retain them if you do not enhance and revise the comprehensive package that you're offering them? If you're only offering 5-10 days of PTO, meaning like vacation time, you are going to lose your talent, period, end of discussion. And you think about it, right? Like, let's say someone gets sick with COVID. This all comes back to COVID for me. Let's say someone gets sick with COVID. They use all of their sick time. If they then have a different illness, or they get sick with COVID again later in the year, because it can happen, and, maybe they even need time to get vaccinated, right? Like, that time out of the business, that's now taking from their vacation time if you have not enhanced the PTO offerings. So now that person who had 10 days of PTO really probably only has 5, because maybe they've used 40 hours of sick time and then 40 hours of their vacation time. So they have 5 days in an entire year to take vacation. It's just not going to be sustainable. It's not going to be a good way to retain your team. So if you're listening to this and you have been thinking about, because, it's the start of the year, you want to look at things, you want to revise and advance and enhance the offerings that you are providing your employees, take this as a message to do that today, because there's no better time than the present. Employees are human beings. They are people. We talk about this, right? This is the name and the game of the podcast. We have to treat people like people and recognize that we are not machines. There are machines in place for a reason for certain things, and then there are human beings in place for other things. So, I've been thinking as an HR leader myself, how can we, add to the benefit of working for a particular institution. And I do think the low-hanging fruit is the vacation time. It is the PTO. And obviously, to play devil's advocate to that, you do have to allow people the time off, right? To take the time off. So if the business remains understaffed, those individuals are probably not going to be able to take significant or impactful time off. And I say that by really in terms of being able to actually and truly unplug and step away from what they're doing. So, if you're not giving them that full advantage of really taking the time and really unplugging, it's going to be, one of those things that's like a carrot dangled in front of them that they can't really take advantage of. So when you're thinking about these policies, when you're, maybe you're an employee submitting suggestions in a suggestion box or, offering suggestions to your colleagues, think through that. Like, how are we going to solve this problem? How are we going to implement these things and actually stand behind them? If we're going to allow for unlimited PTO, how are we going to actually allow people to use that PTO? If you're adding 10 days of PTO, how are you going to allow those individuals the opportunity to take that additional PTO? So that is, those are the thoughts that I had really over the weekend that I knew I needed to get down on paper, so to speak, and get out to your ears, because I know I'm not the only person thinking through these things. So I hope you can appreciate where I'm coming from. I hope I didn't sound too frustrated, because my point is, or what I really try to do is I try to capitalize on the things I'm passionate about. And when I say capitalize, I mean like record it in the moment. So like right now, I'm like fired up by this, right? I'm fired up by the idea that we remain understaffed as an industry, and that, COVID has become the biggest part of my job and yet the least interesting and the most administrative and without additional support, right? So like this is my in the moment feeling. It's almost like a diary entry. So I try to really maximize when I'm feeling this passionate about something, because I hope that it translates a little bit better for you as a listener, because it's a little bit more engaging maybe to hear someone that's super excited and passionate about what they're talking about. So not so much a point of frustration. Yes, it is frustrating, but really what I'm trying to get out is that there are solutions to this, and we don't need to keep operating, as in this way just because it's been quote unquote working, because it's only been working because we've been operating in a state of emergency. But we can't continue to operate this way because it's not sustainable. So now we have to take the beginning of this year and think about how are we going to take these moments and make them sustainable, and take these processes away from this fight or flight mode and provide, some additional support. So with that, I hope I triggered some thoughts for you. And if you have some additional ideas, suggestions, thoughts, anything, reach out to me. My link tree is in the show notes, so you can connect with me by email. You can connect with me on Instagram. Again, I am tasking you with the fun objective of sharing this episode or sharing this podcast with someone near and dear to you who you think would enjoy all of the things that we talk about week to week. I so appreciate you being here. Be sure to follow me on Instagram and TikTok at HR Tracy. I'm trying to really make the content as fun as possible because HR can be dry. We know this. So thank you for being here. Stay connected, and I will see you next week.